SEP Fanfic Readings presents 1,000 Words by Olive Juice 28. Chapter 22. Yuletide Cheer. Christmas at the Burrow was almost as loud and hectic as game night in the room, and Hermione enjoyed every moment of it. She and Harry had arrived in time for dinner on Christmas Eve to find most of the family already assembled. They jumped right in, helping Molly with last-minute touches to elaborate buffet of finger foods and snacks she had spread all along the scrubbed wooden table. As the evening progressed, the gathering grew until the teetering house was almost bursting at its seams. Along with the 6 Weasley siblings and 2 parents, Harry, Hermione, and Fleur were joined by Kingsley, Professor McGonagall, and, rather surprisingly, Gawain Robards, who was the head of the Auror department and Harry's boss. Apparently he was tied up with an extremely difficult case, accompanied by a mountain of paperwork, and wasn't going to be able to meet up with his family, who were visiting relatives in Germany. Potter all but dragged me out of the flu yesterday. It was only after I swore on a pair of new Quidditch gloves that I'd come today, and he finally left me alone. The middle-aged, stocky wizard chuckled gruffly. Hermione got the distinct impression that the man came across as somewhat abrasive, but had a much softer side underneath his no-nonsense exterior. She knew Harry held him in very high regard, and considered him a mentor, as well as his superior. She found herself sitting next to him on the sofa for a portion of the night, and was very interested in hearing about the cases he was working on. "You interested in a career as an Auror?" he asked her, after answering several of her thought-provoking questions, and appreciating the quick, sharp way her mind worked. "Honestly," she admitted reluctantly, "no." She cringed, not wanting to offend her best friend's boss, but not about to lie. "I actually have started to think about doing something in the realm of magical creatures, particularly working on behalf of part humans like werewolves and Vila, and other fully sentient beings such as house elves or goblins." Gawain chuckled again, not seeming the least bit offended or even surprised. "Potter's told me all about your passion for house elves. Said you created a group one year at school. Splat, or Spit?" "SPEW," Hermione grudgingly admitted, remembering her brief attempt at rallying her classmates for the cause. "I didn't accomplish much with that, but it's still something that needs to be addressed. Perhaps not as drastically as I'd originally planned," she continued quickly as she saw Gawain raise his eyebrows and quirk an amused smirk, not wanting him to write her off as some idealistic or naive little girl. "I think there's always room for improvement, no matter what cause one is fighting for." She was pleased to see his expression take on a more thoughtful appearance. "You're right about that," he agreed. "If that's truly where your heart is, then I can introduce you to a couple of the folks in the department that'll point you in the right direction." "Oh, that would be wonderful," Hermione smiled sincerely, greatly appreciating the gesture. Gawain waved his hand as if to say that was nothing. "Be happy to. Once you finish school, you come to the office one day with Potter, and we'll continue this conversation." He smiled genially, and heaved himself off the couch in search of a refill for both of his plate and cup. Hermione barely had a split second to reflect on that invitation from Gawain when his seat was taken up by her ginger-haired best friend, the plate in his hands heaped with at least 2 of everything his mother had set out. "Got enough there?" she teased. "Maybe." Ron shrugged and winked at her. She let him to finish chewing before saying anything else. "How's the shop? And George? He seems happy today." Both of them allowed their gazes to wander over to the twin who was seated on the steps, chatting animatedly with Harry. "He is," Ron began. "He's been doing really well. The shop is always busy, and he's constantly coming up with new ideas. He was up till about 2 o'clock this morning, talking with Fred about a new and improved version of the fanged frisbees we used to get at Zonko's. His plan is to give them the ability to spit, too." "That's disgusting." "Yeah, but you know kids would love it. Can you imagine Filch trying to catch one of it sprays slobber all over his greasy head?" Ron was chuckling now, and Hermione couldn't help but join in at the awful thought. Mom didn't know he was planning to bring Fred along today, and was in floods for the first hour after he arrived. Ron nodded his head to the other side of the room, where Fred's portrait had been hung in front of the tall bookshelf, and was currently in a friendly argument with Percy and Charlie, one Percy seemed to be losing. "I'm glad he brought him, and I'm really glad to hear he's doing better." She leaned into her favorite redhead, resting her head on his shoulder. "How's Katie?" she asked, wondering how he'd handle this new topic of conversation. Ron gave a small cough and cleared his throat from whatever he'd been eating. Katie?" he asked in a strained voice. Hermione rolled her eyes and sat straight up again, looking him full in the face. "Yes, Ron, Katie. Katie Bell, former Gryffindor, works at the cafe you visit multiple times a week." Ron's ears were turning red, and he was staring intently at the pile of food still on his plate. She's good, I guess." He trailed off and reluctantly met the brown eyes that were staring him down. Hermione sighed and shook her head, a small smile playing at her mouth. Ron, it's fine. I'm happy for you, honestly. I don't want this to be weird. She saw him relax a little. We're fine, yeah? We're always going to be fine. She gripped his arm and peered into his wide blue eyes. You don't have anything to feel bad or awkward about. She knew that even though Ron clearly had moved on from their not even really a relationship, he still felt guilty and didn't want to hurt her. She appreciated it, but it really wasn't necessary. Ron heaved a big sigh and gave a low chortle. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised that you already heard about Katie. I just didn't want things to be awkward. His gaze roamed across her features, looking for any indication that she might be upset or cross with him. Finding none, he grinned. She's good, Katie. We're not serious or anything. We just have a lot in common, and I see her a lot because we get lunch from there, and we've only ever been on one date so far. His grin turned slightly sheepish. We didn't even get Christmas presents for each other. Instead, decided we'd just go to the Chudley match sometime and buy each other some tickets. That's terrific, Ron. Hermione meant it. She was happy for her friend, and was glad that they had maneuvered this small hurdle fairly easily. What about you? Ron asked, taking another huge bite of a meat pie. Me? Hermione squeaked, not really sure how to answer what she knew was coming. Yeah, you got your eye on anyone? She stalled. Not really. Nothing serious. Nothing worth mentioning at the moment, no. She was mumbling, which she rarely did, and was desperately hoping Ron would just drop it because she wasn't ready to tell him about Draco, nor was she sure what she would even say. They weren't officially a couple. They were barely more than friends, although she was definitely hoping they could become something more. She wasn't comfortable explaining all of that, and luckily she was saved from having to do so by Charlie hollering that it was time for the 3-on-3 glow-in-the-dark Quidditch. In response, Ron thrust his still half-full plate into her lap and went charging out the door, leaving her to huff in great relief as she picked up an abandoned sandwich and took a bite. Her eyes wandered around the space, and she drank in the familiar warmth and comfort she had always found at the Burrow. Arthur, Molly, Kingsley, and Professor McGonagall were seated around a small table, tucked in the corner of the sitting room. Gawain was being peppered with questions by Percy, and Fleur appeared to be heading out the door to watch the Quidditch match. Taking the opportunity to have a moment to herself, Hermione slipped upstairs to Ginny's room, where she would be spending the night. She went straight to her bag, which was sitting on a trunk in the corner, and pulled out the letter from Draco. She had read it almost immediately after Harry had given it to her the day before, but hadn't yet responded. She didn't want to just jot down a quick reply, so she had mulled it over while she finished wrapping presents and packing for her time with Ron's family. While Draco's note wasn't remotely romantic, it was very thoughtful and friendly, and shared more about himself than she'd expected. She had laughed out loud at the image she'd painted of Narcissa sneaking his Nutella, and made a mental note to pop into a Muggle grocery once she got back at Grimmauld Place to pick up some more. She glanced down at the parchment in her hand, rereading his thoughts for the 4th or 5th time since she'd received it. While petting Crookshanks absent-mindedly, her ginger pet had made his home at the Burrow while she was Horcrux hunting with the boys, and she'd hated to uproot him again. He thoroughly enjoyed stalking the gnomes in the garden, and seemed to have attached himself to Molly, most likely due to her incessant need to feed any living creature within her line of sight. Hermione had spotted Crookshanks curled up in the Weasley matriarch's lap on more than one occasion, and it warmed her heart to know that he brought comfort to the sweet woman. Focusing on the letter once more, she smiled and her heart flooded the teeniest bit. If anyone had told her back in 5th or 6th year that one day she would be getting amiable letters from Draco, my father will hear about this, Malfoy, she would have questioned their sanity. She chuckled to herself, refolded the note, and tucked it back into her bag. She preferred to keep her correspondence out of the prying eyes of the Ministry, so her response would have to go through Harry. Knowing that wouldn't happen until they were back at Grimmauld, she decided to wait a little longer, and hoped she would have something interesting to share about her time at the Burrow. Draco never knew babies could be so loud or so messy. Teddy Lupin was 9 months old and possessed a very strong set of lungs. He was generally a happy little chap, but his cheerfulness was typically expressed through high-pitched shrieks and bouts of hollering at anyone in his near vicinity. He was fairly easily distracted, but seemed to prefer mundane items like wooden spoons and copper pots to anything his grandmother, aunts, or cousin could conjure. Currently, Draco was sitting on the floor in the parlor, surrounded by random kitchen supplies, an inordinate amount of brightly colored blocks, and a menagerie of stuffed animals. Teddy had decided his cousin's lap was the most comfortable spot and was currently sprawled across it while gnawing on a teething biscuit. Draco tried, unsuccessfully, not to flinch as soggy crumbs attached themselves to his trousers every time the wiggly boy shifted. Abandoning the last bit of cookie and planting it firmly on the previously clean sleeve of his human chair, Teddy rolled himself over, grasping Draco's knee with his sticky little hands, and leaving sugary fingerprints behind as he lunged towards the carpet and the collection of the toys there. Giving a slight huff of exasperation, Draco glanced up to find his mother and aunt watching the whole thing, chuckling at his predicament. "He seems quite taken with you," Andromeda observed as his nephew tried to wipe his wool trousers clean, but to no avail. "His hair has matched yours for over an hour now, which is rather unusual." She waved her wand, and the evidence of Teddy's snack vanished. Draco stopped searching for his wand amidst the topography of toys to glance back at the youngster, who, sure enough, was still sporting white blonde locks. He couldn't help the smile that spread across his face. His baby cousin might be messy, but he was rather entertaining. His gaze shifted to his mother, who he was surprised to see had tears in her eyes. Cocking an eyebrow in question, she waved her hand and sniffed, giving a watery chuckle in response. "Don't mind me," Narcissa huffed. "I'm just remembering you at this age. With Teddy's hair that color, it's hard not to. You were just as active and boisterous." She gave a small laugh and shook her head. "Once you started crawling, the house elves refused to allow you into the kitchen. You would make a beeline for the lower cabinets and take out all the pots and pans. Drove them mad." She wiped the corners of her eyes, her smile growing. "Then, when you began walking, they insisted on blocking the stairs so you couldn't go up or down on your own. They were so very worried you would fall. I once caught you up about 3 steps, yelling at the top of your lungs, because 3 of the elves were barring your path. Very stubborn you were." Andromeda was laughing along with her sister, and Draco, although slightly pink in the cheeks, was chortling too. He knew he had been quite a handful as a small child. "Dora used to disappear," Andromeda stated in a rather far-off voice. She was watching Teddy with unfocused eyes as she recalled her daughter's antics. "She loved to hide, even as a baby, no older than Teddy. I'd find her behind chairs, in closets, under the bed. The first few times it happened, it scared me witless. Thought she'd somehow vanished. After multiple episodes, though, I came to accept this new game of hers and learned her favorite spots." She chuckled sadly. "She would have been such a wonderful mother." Tears fell silently down her cheeks as she continued to gaze at her grandson. Narcissa clutched her sister's hand, her own tears making similar tracks. Draco felt his eyes prick, and, by way of distraction, resumed his efforts to locate his wand. After a few seconds, he found it underneath a particularly floppy stuffed dragon. The green plush creature was incredibly soft and almost as big as Teddy. He set it on the floor, directly in the baby's path, and pointed his wand at it. The dragon's wings slowly flapped up and down, and tiny swirls of mist appeared to come out of its felt nostrils. Teddy froze at the sight. He scooted closer and watched as the dragon's tail waved lazily from side to side. Draco kept an eye on the boy, not wanting to startle him with any sudden movements. Teddy leaned forward and gently touched one chubby finger to the dragon's fuzzy snout. Draco flicked his wand, and the dragon let out a small snort. At once, the room was filled with Teddy's contagious belly laugh, which caused all 3 adults to join in. After 3/4 of an hour of charming various stuffed animals to amuse Teddy, Draco excused himself to stretch his legs. He wandered off towards his quarters and decided to check on his Felix Felicis, which was brewing in the study across the hall from his bedroom. Pleased with the progress he found, he stirred the thickening potion a few times and then sank into the leather armchair by the window. He let his gaze wander out to the grounds where everything was covered in a blanket of pristine white snow. It glittered slightly in the fading Christmas Day sunlight, reminding him of fairy lights. That reminded him of the Halloween party, which reminded him of a bright green, feathery bundle of happiness. He couldn't escape the smile that tugged on his lips as he recalled the way Hermione had looked that night. He had noticed his thoughts turning to the curly-haired witch with increasing frequency over the holiday, and every instance brought a feeling of buoyancy and contentment. He had always sneered at the other wizards who seemed to go soft over girls, positive that he would never succumb to the fluttering heartbeats and flowery sentiments his peers were obviously too weak to fend off. He remembered giving Goyle a particularly hard time when he found out his feather Slytherin had a mild crush on Millicent Bulstrode during 4th year. Goyle's flushed cheeks and glassy eyes as he trailed behind her in the corridors made him snort with derision. If only Goyle could see him now, he chuckled lowly and shook his head. He didn't even know exactly what he and Hermione were at the moment, but she made him smile. She gave him hope, and he had never been happier in his life. For the first time in what seemed like forever, Draco didn't have a plan or an agenda. He didn't know what would happen in the days, weeks, or months to come. He didn't know what the next step was for him and his favorite Gryffindor. but he was perfectly okay with that. For once in his life, it was the journey, not the destination, that he was looking forward to.